Christopher Nolan's new film Tenet, about which almost no one knows a single thing except that it is a Christopher Nolan film and thus likely to be a stylish, overly self-serious action movie in which a cast of extremely impressive actors in sharply tailored Brooks Brothers suits have gunfights and car chases augmented by some kind of uniquely, possibly sci-fi inflected special effects and/or narrative gimmick that is also a metaphor for its own screenwriting technique, was supposed to be hitting theaters this Thursday after several global pandemic-induced delays, but was instead pushed ahead 1 month to August and will probably get pushed ahead again, because even though a handful of major US cities that did take responsible measures early on to flatten the curve via lockdown, stay-at-home directives, and mask ordinances, etc. are indeed back on track toward phased reopenings of services like movie theaters in the near future, the places that took a different approach are somehow now seeing the opposite result. Funny how that works. Meaning we'll probably have to do this whole dance all over again in a few months, because what good does tried to warn you even do at this point? Besides, in this particular case, the politics of show business are actually much more central to the situation and seemingly much more cynical, but interesting, than the politics of politics, so thank Rayo for small favors. Because, well, the question of whether a major theater chain as opposed to a nationwide mini-boom in independent pop-up drive-ins, which, yes, fun, cute, nostalgic, nice to see, no, I don't think will be a permanent comeback situation post-COVID-19, sadly, but by all means, go enjoy the gimmick while it's there, are going to open again, is the literal billion-dollar life-or-death question for Hollywood right now. It's Tenet that's become the symbolic nuclear football of the whole scenario, somehow. Whereas many of summer 2020's would have been blockbusters have been grudgingly content to be shuffled ahead to fall, winter, or next year, like Godzilla vs. Kong, Black Widow, Wonder Woman 1984, Top Gun Maverick, the new James Bond, Ghostbusters Afterlife, etc., while others like Greyhound, Artemis Fowl, Scoob, and the upcoming one and only Ivan became straight-to-video releases. Tenet, from Nolan's longtime home base at Warner Brothers, and Disney's live-action reworking of Mulan have remained the two big midsummer releases whose respective release dates have thus far remained stuck to their guns adamantly that they will be coming out as traditional theatrical exclusives, and have simply continued to just nudge the actual dates forward a few weeks at a time as the United States continues to fail spectacularly at clearing the series of increasingly low bars for functioning 21st century society, though both for markedly different reasons. Mulan's holding pattern was seemingly slightly based less on US theaters' timetable than that of China's, where the pandemic was brought under control significantly more quickly and efficiently, in a manner of speaking, especially in large urban centers. The film, while shot in English, is viewed as one of the biggest opportunities yet for the mouse to establish a domestic cultural foothold beyond its stature as an importer brand in the Chinese and wider East Asian market, framed as a melding of the well-regarded and original animated Mulan as a big-budget Western summer action tentpole, and also a legitimate entry in the specifically Chinese wuxia fantasy martial arts genre. Plus, with Black Widow now delayed until fall, it now represents the opening volley of Disney's aggressive 2020 and beyond image makeover push for the content of its product both on-screen and behind the camera, a mega-budget licensed IP blockbuster with a global audience, international cast, a female lead, and a female director. Basically, whatever China was going to open its theaters again, Mulan was probably going to be in them, and Disney was really crossing their fingers that they wouldn't have to put it in there with US theaters still closed and have to have the talk with American audiences about how just because we're not number one anymore doesn't mean you're not still special in your own way there, slugger. But it turns out China wasn't feeling great about theaters opening yet either, so still we wait. Tenet, on the other hand, seemed like the sort of film that was going to do well pretty much whenever they released it, even in a year when there wasn't a viral pandemic, a quote-unquote grown-ups blockbuster where people talk about science and metaphysics in between and sometimes during the gunfights, with a plot apparently so mind-blowing they've sworn everyone to secrecy, and also Michael Caine is there. But the film kept its feet firmly planted in the we're coming out on IMAX screens in the summer, even if audiences are literally taking their lives in their own hands to watch its soil, and hasn't wanted to budge much, with sporadic reports, unsourced mostly as gossip, leaking out to the trades that the main culprit for this is Nolan himself, apparently deeply committed to the idea that his film first be seen in the size and scope that he originally designed it for, which is reasonable, and depending on who you want to believe, perhaps a bit drunk on the Kool-Aid of his own Kubrick reincarnated film school fandom persona, and driven by an egomaniacal desire to be the one among film directors who got the credit for standing fast and saving the craft of proper theatrical filmmaking from the Netflix abyss during the crisis. I find that last one to be a little bit on the unbelievable side, to be honest, or at the very least exaggerated, the kind of catty, petty blind item chatter that would slip out from an executive who'd rather see him back down and just stream the thing already, or a rival studio that wants to see Warner Brothers take an L for the period. Obviously, I have no special knowledge of what's going to happen with either of these films. For all I know, they'll have both had new delays announced by the time this episode episode airs the first time or whenever you first watch it. And while I'd like to think I know a little something about the business side of the film industry, I don't know very much more than any other non-medical professional about virus protection or pandemic management. So it would be the height of irresponsibility for me to offer any opinion on how and when theaters should be reopening or what should or shouldn't be happening in or around them if and when they do, other than find smart people who do know those answers, ask them, and then do what they say. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be a high-minded or unbothered person about it, as if the greater overriding horror of living through a really, really stupid version of the first half of Stephen King's The Stand wasn't bad enough. The fact that I'm watching the death count soar, friends and colleagues get sick and even lose their loved ones to the virus, the basic edifices of society and civilization fall down around me, and an omnipresence of medical sterilization aesthetic not be great for someone with serious anxiety issues when it comes to anything vaguely hospital-related. Yeah, it's like the least important part of all this, but the fact that I don't even get to distract myself for a couple hours with a new Godzilla or Top Gun either, yeah, it's kind of pissing me off. No clue how much longer this facade of relative sanity can actually last. Guess we'll find out together. But what I do know is that framing these discussions around the fortunes of individual films, the personal ambitions, real or imagined, of individual filmmakers, the bottom line of film studios or business models of theater chains is kind of coming at this from a fundamentally wrong perspective, at least from my, perspective. At the end of the day, all these things come down to the mathematics of not simply people's livelihoods, but their lives. Turning the machinery of all this back on, even a moment before we're absolutely sure it's safe enough to do so, inevitably means asking the people who have to handle the publicizing and releasing of the films themselves, workers on film and post-production crews, theater employees, and yes, critics like myself, to put themselves back out into the not-yet post-virus world, in most cases, whether they wish to or not, just for their jobs, in order to facilitate the choice of audiences to go or not go. And yes, I live in reality, so I know that we'll probably be asked to accept some sort of imperfect compromise, several of them, rather than an ideal solution to all of this, but I feel like we don't see this end of it being thought about or talked about at all, and it should be the place we're starting at. I mean, just because Tenet runs backwards, do our priorities have to? Well, now it's August, and along with absolutely nothing getting any better, and Tenet now on a staggered release strategy, we now have the first genuinely meaningful blockbuster domino that could have falling in the form of Disney deciding that what was to be their big midsummer action feature, Mulan, is going to skip theaters and instead become a premium price rental on the Disney Plus service. That's a big deal. Seriously, whether or not you give a damn about Mulan or not, every other major completed feature that was supposed to hit over the summer and was considered too big to not put in theaters has either been gradually pushed ahead because an entire country has been forced to go through this nightmare in a complete vacuum of intellectual leadership, so Hollywood and every other business has just had to make shit up as they go along, or just delayed indefinitely. But Mulan and Tenet were the big two that Disney and Warner Brothers, aka Disney and AT&T Time Warner, aka the two giant corporations whose studio arms are kind of holding up the business right now, we're keeping on deck as the last best hope for salvaging a summer that's otherwise now going to be a total write-off because, the whole plague thing. Tenet because Christopher Nolan's Everyone is Dressed in Sharp Menswear talking about metaphysics and shot through a desaturation filter, so this robbery heist shoot 'em up cops and robbers bang bang wee is actually for grown-ups aesthetic means that it can technically also be in the books as an early fall awards bait because they can't just give all the Oscars to Netflix this year, and Mulan because it was primed to do huge business in China, and they seem like they were a bit more ahead of the ball than we were on this whole thing. But now it's pretty clear that nothing is going to get better, and in fact it's probably going to get a lot worse, until if and when someone else is in charge of literally everything, I guess. So Mulan is off to streaming, and we'll see how it goes, apparently. I guess it's gonna do fine, like the curiosity factor is there, and if you're already paying for Plus, I don't know, that's not my department, we'll see. I mostly feel bad for people who made the movie, like director Nikki Caro, who's been grinding it out in Hollywood for years, and finally got tapped for what was gonna be a huge release with all this hype of being a woman-led and directed blockbuster, and now whatever success it does or doesn't have is gonna have this straight-to-premium streaming under COVID asterisk on it. Like, that sucks. That completely independently from Disney industry business bullshit, or even if you don't give a damn about this particular movie, that just sucks. And meanwhile, now the bandage has been ripped off, one way or another. Every studio with unreleased movies has been making a series of calculations to whether they release now and earn back what they can, or wait because they don't know when productions will be finished for the coming year, and no one has wanted to make the first big moves because, let's face it, if and when there's an other side to this madness, not only is the first wave of films opening in actually safe now theaters going to do gigantic inflated numbers, it's plausible that a kind of pop culture stigma is going to end up attached to the films that did go early to streaming, as in, I wonder what made them think this was okay to take the L on, but not that. Of course, in reality, it's more complicated. Not every studio is in Disney's position, where they have their own private streaming service that's become a COVID-era secondary babysitter for millions, but also the problem of their other big on-deck franchise, the Marvel movies, needing to come out in a certain roundabout order that now includes a slate of TV series that aren't totally finished yet. That having been said, if I was a betting man, and Okay, actually I am, but just, not right now on this. Would I put money on Black Widow being the next one up instead of actually coming out in October? Yeah, probably. I'm just trying not to think about October because there's probably no real Halloween this year, and I don't want to spend a week in the fetal position thinking about that until I have to. More immediately, I feel like the countdown clock has probably started on Warner Brothers giving up and saying Tenet will get some kind of VOD release in the US, even if it's theatrical everywhere else, because they need to get that money back. Even though, yes, they will still primarily put it in theaters to say that they did, because apparently this is a big deal for Christopher Nolan. As for everything else, well, the hell if I know. I can barely predict which mood I'm going to pretend to be in each day instead of seething incomprehensible rage, which is honestly kind of mirroring in reverse the entire situation. Everyone agrees the dam is about to break, but for some reason it's become more important that we don't know what it's actually been holding back. But the pitch coming from Christopher Nolan and some of his supporters, to be clear, a great filmmaker and of the most part of great films, for people going to see Tenet has opted to go above and beyond the concept of pragmatic, we're trying to triage an industry capitalist rhetoric, to full-on the vision is worth the sacrifice territory, where it's essentially being presented that rather than his work arriving to rescue theatrical distribution from a dismal summer, theatrical distribution now must be turned back on with all the attendant risk to theater workers, cleaners, attendees that entails, and that both audiences and critics should have as their only option potentially the riskiest one, in order to ensure that his particular artistic vision is received in exactly the manner he'd planned. And whether that's marketing or self-promotion or actual persona, it can only be described from where I sit as coming off like spectacular levels of tone-deaf, callous, egomaniacal self-involvement. I mean, how much more plainly do I have to say it? I liked Inception as much as anyone, but I'm not going to risk getting sick and dying to watch another one. And while it might be merely disappointing and silly to force that kind of choice on audiences for what amounts to voluntary entertainment, also doing it with regards to press and journalists whose ability to earn a living is tied up in that choice is pretty close to an obscenity. I love movies. I love art of all kinds. I'm not sure any of them are worth this, though. And while we're on the subject, Chris, if this is purely an ego trip thing, y'all need to slow down, bro. I mean, you're good, but all the film bros declaring you the new whoever for a decade might have finally gone to your head. Reality check. You ain't fun enough to be Orson Welles, you ain't prolific enough to be Hitchcock, your craftsman bona fides aren't genuine enough to be Mann, Frankenheimer, Ridley, or Tony, and you ain't interesting enough to be Kubrick. Whatever else you may think of them, pretty much all the live-action Disney remakes are more interesting to view as cultural artifacts than they are as individual films, which isn't to say that I found mostly bad. If anything, the bulk of them have settled into complacent mode, just above average, and that frankly should be the baseline of expected quality when something's being produced by the biggest, most efficient commercial entertainment empire that's ever existed, which also now has access to and understanding how to actually utilize the social media panopticon to precisely predict and respond to global popular trends. So yeah, most of these have been fine, I guess, and though certainly no replacement for their predecessors. But the most interesting things about them to examine and to say about, with the outlier exception of complete reimaginings like Maleficent, tend to come from looking at them as vivisected art objects. What choices were made in adaptation, what cultural currents are being ridden, resisted, or responded to, which demographic is being serviced by which decision, etc. And Mulan arrives the most loaded of any entry thus far in that regard, not in the least because it was willed into existence as part of the ongoing push push to further unify the Chinese and American side of the Mouse's post-national blockbuster game, but also, at least originally as scheduled, as part of the ongoing pivot to big-scale summer genre films that retain their scope and franchise ambitions, but feature diverse casts and creators and a heavy emphasis on female leads and directors. But it's also because, unlike other Disney princess properties generally based on often-told public domain Western fairy tales, the animated Mulan was the first time most American audiences had heard of the story, whereas in China, the legend of Hua Mulan, who may have existed, or may not, or may be a composite of several different unrelated women, who also may or may not have had similar experiences and may or may not have existed across like an indeterminate period of about 300 to 400 years, give or take, in the very distant past, is a beloved story of national patriotic mythology going back, like I said, a really long time, that everyone knows and has been written, rewritten, performed, sung, filmed, televised, etc. a lot of times previously. So suffice to say, there actually are more interesting things at play in trying to hammer out one of the better, but also one of the more spare, matter-of-fact, being animated is 70% of what makes this special and interesting, and if you take that out, what's the point? Movies of the Disney Renaissance period into a 2020 live-action feature, then whether or not it works without the wisecracking Eddie Murphy dragon or the songs. You know, there's a whole actual culture, weight of history, and a lot of prior material and expectation also in play. And so it's both something of a relief and also a bit of an anticlimax to recognize that Nikki Caro's big-budget, wuxia-light girl power melodrama is ultimately pretty good. Yeah, it ends stronger than it opens, it only drags in a few spots, it has several legitimately action sequences, which I have to assume will be outright mind-blowing to very young viewers who likely haven't seen many films like this otherwise. Makes good use of a strong supporting cast. Li Yifei is carrying the lead part solidly, despite being made to effectively play her own straight woman in a lot of scenes by a few curious narrative decisions. There's some interesting story choices made with the bad guys I didn't exactly see coming, as the main villain is fairly one-dimensional. It basically works. But what's at once frustrating, but again also at least interesting to the point where it becomes interesting to notice more so than the main plot, is that we are once again in the territory of a remake of something that was already good scenario, where the end result is weakest when it's compelled to recreate important beats from the original, and you're realizing, you see, this is why she had Eddie Murphy to talk to when she was alone instead of her own voiceover, or this montage could probably use a song explaining the context, whereas the strongest stuff is almost uniformly all the stuff that's been added to either pump the film up into a punchier action fantasy flick, fill in for the musical comedy that's been excised, or sharpen a more radical edge to the original's girl disguised as boy goes to war feminist bona fides, the solution to which turns out to be make it into a Star Wars movie. No, for real. See, whereas in the original, meaning the Disney original, Mulan was just sort of tomboyish and spunky and learned how to be good at fighting in the army, in this version, she's a natural-born warrior capable of harnessing and unleashing near superhuman levels of strength, agility, and martial arts skills even as a young child, thanks to hypersensitivity to the natural forces of Qi, which in this fantasy-ish version of sometime between 330 and 500 AD, I think because the villains are the Roran Khaganate, is treated as literally the Force, but also something women aren't supposed to have or use because that's called a witch. Yeah, so this allows the film to literalize the psychological narrative, whereby even though Mulan is the best soldier in her unit, despite trying to conceal the full extent of her abilities, because she's also doing a dark side, basically, by lying to everyone, she's not able to unleash the full potential of whatever jacked up Qi Kung Fu superpowers might be unless she comes out as being a woman, which is a problem she'll have to deal with and overcome because the main bad guy they're supposed to be protecting China from is backed up by an older, significantly angrier at the Chinese patriarchy, Qi-using warrior witch who's got way scarier powers and can take her in a fight, and yes, they do the we're not so different, you and me should team up thing with every bit of the quasi-flirtatious seduction to the dark side coding that one expects, because giving fanfic shippers something new to play with now is just another part of ancillary merchandising, and Disney is the Jeremy Wade of queerbaiting. All of which is, yeah,
kinda dumb, but also just, are we really doing this enough to be novel? And it notably does leap to the foreground right around the same time at midpoint, when the film largely dials way back on retreading the original and way up on the new stuff, which, yes, includes Mulan being basically a Jedi and fighting a witch who also I think is part bird maybe, but also has kick-ass fights in cool locations, big action, and really starts to move. So, I mean, 6 of one, half dozen of the other, I was having a good time with it. I mean, look, I'll put it to you this way. As it was wrapping up, I was all set to say, yeah, alright, 6 out of 10, it's pretty good, but only just pretty good, and then they went and put down a bad guy in a way that made me go, okay, that was awesome. That was straight up, no grading curve, 90s Hong Kong, awesome right there, and for that, I bump it up to a solid 7. Yeah, worth a shot, give it a look.
So the pop culture story of the weekend, I guess, was as projected, i.e. did you watch it, did you like it, was it worth the premium VOD price, was the live-action Mulan remake, which they would sort of prefer you didn't think of as a remake, because while it's promotionally trading on nostalgia for the 1998 animated movie and features a lot of subtle and unsubtle callbacks there too, it's also significantly different, and they're both technically two retellings among many of a folk legend of ancient China that's been adapted and presented a lot, because anything believed to have been composed sometime in the 4th century and then written down sometime in the 6th is definitely public domain at this point. I reviewed the movie on the other show. I thought it was fine, fun, over the top and silly in spots, but, you know, was I supposed to be not expecting that? Because it seems like that's a significant amount of negative criticism, and all I can think is, somebody in a Chinese martial arts fantasy film defied the laws of physics while fighting? You don't say. In a movie that co-stars Donnie Yen? And Jet Li? And Jason Scott Lee?
How does a man I once killed return to challenge me?
Well, I for one am just shocked. But okay, some of the dissonance, well, apart from additional grievances related to geopolitical stances of audiences versus, apparently, certain members of the cast vis-a-vis the Chinese government, which extremely serious, not something I'm necessarily a first-hand expert in, and also not something I would expect to solve with a web video or a tweet, was evidently related to confusion over earlier indications that popular elements from the animated version, such as musical sequences and the talking dragon, voiced by Eddie Murphy, had been excised from this new version in the name of either realism or historical cultural respect, which obviously seems off, since very little about this is realistic or particularly historical, even if one knows next to nothing about the history of ancient China. There are, of course, conflicting narratives as to what animated certain narrative decisions here, as I've mentioned in the review, unpacking all the cross-cultural compromises and message testing by which Mulan's storyline was arrived at is probably more interesting than the movie itself, but in the case of Mushu the Dragon and why no one is singing the plot, it's likely more a matter of practicality. Disney wants Mulan to make lots of money at the Chinese box office at some point, and two of the things that translate into other languages the least well are verbal comedy based on one-liners and pop culture references, and the emotional storytelling being conveyed via song lyrics. Though it's certainly not impossible that this version of the story is erring on the side of not too many jokes, since it is indeed framing Hua Mulan's character as being much more in the national folk heroine mode traditionally occupied in Chinese popular history rather than the Disney princess but with sword version the House of Mickey previously cultivated for its own purpose. This Mulan is a serious-minded and stoic figure whose personal arc includes not only rediscovery of suppressed self-confidence but the expanding of her filial commitment to protect her family into patriotic zeal to protect her entire country. You might say it's sort of like the difference between the $10 bill Alexander Hamilton and the now streaming on Disney Plus Alexander Hamilton, a comparison which, along with the rest of this, might lead one to inevitably ask, so wait, did this woman actually even exist? The short answer is, maybe. Possibly. Depends on who you ask, how you frame the question, and how flexible you're willing to be regarding the concept that we can be sure about any factual details regarding events taking place when the AD digits were only in the 3s. So, short answer, we don't know. To give you some idea of how vague this is, the broadest enclosure of time we have dates the origin of Hua Mulan as the heroine of popular folktales to a period of Chinese history known as the Nanbei Chao or Northern and Southern dynasties, roughly 386 to 589 AD, which marked the end of the chaotic 16 Kingdoms period, the collapse of the so-called Wuhu barbarian states, and saw the beginning of previously unprecedented cultural unification across what we now think of as the singular China, with the migration and population increase of Hansu Chinese, today the world's largest ethnic group, from the Yellow River Basin to the south of the Yangtze. So, a period of about 200 years, give or take, from when the average lifespan for a human was around, 40 if you were lucky. Anyway, the earliest mention that we know of Hua Mulan is from an anthology of ancient recovered and transcribed music text called the Music Bureau Collection that was collected in ancient China sometime between the 11th and 12th century and includes a lyric poem called the Ballad of Hua Mulan, which the text itself notes as having been taken from a previous collection of transcriptions dated to the Southern Chen dynasty of the 6th century, where it was taken in a record of then-contemporary folk songs and traditional ballads. Consisted of 31 couplets, this is pretty much the basis of what every adaptation of the story has jumped off from, and it's pretty sparse and matter-of-fact. In this initial version, there's no modern-day sexism or self-doubt to overcome. There's a war on, the emperor is conscripting soldiers to fight for their side. Since her father is old, she opts to go in his place disguised as a man because it's an all-male regiment. Nobody in the family or village objects to this. Evidently, she already knows her way around a horse and weaponry, and this isn't a big deal. Wherever and whenever this was written, she goes off and does a decade of warfighting, wins, graciously declines a court position with the emperor, goes back to the village, takes off the man costume. The fellow soldiers who escorted her back go, "Oh, hey, he was a she this whole time. Huh. My gender assumptions have been mildly upended. How about that?"
I am shocked. Shocked! Well, not that shocked.
That's pretty much it. Once upon a time, somebody performed admirably and didn't make a whole big thing out of it. Good for them is kind of a popular Chinese folk hero template the further back you go. So all the various secret identities, social gender expectation, working through my own anxieties, quasi-homoerotic 12th night type romantic stuff people are more familiar with from modern retellings, that all starts to get grafted on in subsequent more elaborate, more fleshed out dramatizations and retellings. It's somewhat unclear whether the cultural sanctification of Hua Mulan as folk heroine to be emulated as patriotic national icon comes about later, during, or because of the popularity of the retold dramatic versions, and since it's thus far proven impossible to discern whether the original ballad was wholly fictional, based on a real person, inspired by a real person, a combination of several real people, which is not an unlikely scenario in itself, since women masquerading as men in wartime is actually not that historically uncommon, especially in the ancient world, we also can't say precisely when and where the original ballad story is supposed to have taken place, though the sparse details are generally thought to indicate Mulan coming from a village in the Northern Wei dynasty, which at the time would have made her part of the Jianbei nomadic peoples, ancestors of the Mongols who settled in that part of China in the 3rd century and eventually integrated with the larger Han majority, which makes a certain amount of sense given that the Jianbei are believed to have retained traditions from their prior nomadic society, including training young women in archery, combat, and horseback riding. Okay. In any case, whichever region Mulan would have hailed from, the military campaign she'd have participated in would almost certainly have been the sustained conflict between Northern Wei and the Rouran Khaganate, which is the case, however loosely depicted, in the new movie. That's not to say that every long-lived version in Chinese folk history is held to the rigidity of this classical version, however, as a beloved icon already likely being treated as someone who may as well have existed whether they did or not before any or most of this was written down formally in the first place. Hua Mulan tends to pop up elsewhere in Asian folk history throughout. One of the most notable spots is as a supporting character in the 1695 historical fiction novel The Romance of Xu and Tang by Chu Renho, which was a fictionalized account of the rise of the Tang dynasty in 618 AD, written as an anti-imperial criticism of the then only 50 years old but eventually 268 years long Qing dynasty. Now in this version, not only does Mulan exist 1 to 2 centuries later than typically depicted, she has another fighting woman ally in the form of a warrior princess named Zhan Yang, who discovers her identity, and in some translations they subsequently become so close as to be considered bonded in a laotong, a kind of legally and spiritually sanctified BFF blood sister marriage between two women that existed in that period of ancient China, though normally in the form of a family contract like an arranged marriage beginning in childhood rather than between two adult women. And don't get all excited, kids, Romance of Xu and Tang does not end well at all for Mulan.
But then again, who does?
And, yeah, to summarize, there is no way to say if yes or not to what extent Hua Mulan was a real person, though in the end the question at this point tends to become whether or not she needs to have been. In the abstract, the story has managed to be both inspirational and entertaining for longer than most things will ever exist, to have been provably real or not, across not only centuries, but the bounds of language, culture, civilization, philosophy. Ultimately, that's the point where an idea transcends the question of where it came from, or whether or not its most recent movie is, just okay.